The positive thing about being a critic is that on occasion you get the opportunity to watch a show or a movie or read a comic book or whatever that is, quite frankly, something that's really, really enjoyable, like I got to do with Violet Evergarden. Then you run into something that is the opposite of that, like Netflix's version of Cowboy Bebop, or in this case, Gundam Seed. It's a tough show to watch, not because of the dramatic elements, just so you know. It's because it's a bad television show. But let me start by giving credit where it's due. The concept of Gundam Seed is not a bad one. Not at all, to be honest with you. It could have been a great show, actually. And it's rather obvious that they're looking to do sort of a spin on the 1 Year War. After Turn A Gundam came out and basically brought a close to Tamino's storytelling, at least until Reconquista in G, doing a spin-off of a proven formula isn't a bad idea, especially if you want to add layers to it, by basically turning up the dickishness of all the parties involved to 11, and adding in some shadow players that you could use later on or during the course of it. Not to mention, that kind of a world is a good one to have, because you're going to be telling a story about two friends divided by a war and all the complications that it brings around, and you're going to need things that are going to pull them in different direction. The thing is, almost any concept can be turned into a good story. The hardest part of storytelling is execution, and Gundam Seed fails to stick the landing on almost every single element that it needs to be a really good show. I'll be honest, of all the Gundam series that are out there, and there's quite a few that I've seen, this is easily the worst. Well, I say that without having seen Seed Destiny yet, but trust me, I ain't watching that unless somebody pays me. What I'm going to do is break down some of the biggest problems of this show on their own, section by section. We're going to start by talking about Kirayamato. Then we're going to talk about Seed's plot problems and how it suffers from basically being a product of its time. And then we're going to close out with the issue of show, don't tell, and then I'll do a nice little wrap up. So, let's get started. Kirayamato, aliases Jesus, or Gary Stew. Alright, let's get started with Kirayamato. Specifically, the obvious comparisons between him and the original Gundam protagonist, whom he is kind of based on, Amuro Ray. Now, why I'm using this comparison point, aside from any obvious reasons, is I really feel like a lot of the things that get done wrong with Kira were things that were done right with Amuro Ray by Yoshiyuki Tamino at the end of the 1970s. Kirayamato is a Gary Stew. It's a walking plot device. He is a character that is essentially spared all of the suffering that Amuro Ray had to go through in his show, and as such is a weaker character for it. In situations where Amuro would have to learn on the fly or possibly lose battles, Kirayamato literally plot devices his way out of them. Oh, pause, real quick. If you hear me switch between calling him Kirayamato and Kirayamato, blame the fact that I've watched both dubs of this show in my lifetime. The first one, way back in the day, always called him Kirayamato. The most recent calls him Kirayamato, which is probably the correct pronunciation. So, excuse me if my brain goes dumb for a second whenever I'm mentioning his name. But anyway, when I talk about Kira plot devising his way out of things, I mean this is a character that rewrote an operating system in less than 2 minutes in the middle of a firefight, and then somehow, I guess, programmed a mobile suit to be lighter? I don't know how the hell that worked. And again, he does it mid-fight while surrounded by enemies. The show attempts to explain that because he's a coordinator, that he can do this sort of thing. But then he goes on to consistently embarrass other coordinators in combat, and you see them struggle to do things that he's already done, or just not do it in general, and he seems just that much more competent than they are in ability. Now, by the way, they don't come across as good, they come across as shit because he is basically godlike. The only struggles that he seems to have are simply the fact that he is an emotional wreck all of the time because he's a big fucking baby, or that he might have to have his friend as an enemy over and over again. The other elements of his life honestly aren't that bad, especially in comparison to a character like Amuro Ray. The crew of Kira's ship always treats him pretty well. He's constantly given the rest that he needs to battle properly, and overall is looked upon fairly fondly by the crew. Meanwhile, Amuro Ray had to run a gauntlet of suffering that mentally broke him. Days where he was barely getting any sleep or anything to eat. I mean, hell, in the very first fight that he has in the original RX-78-2, he has to fight while reading an instruction manual. He is a character that makes mistakes. At one point, when he mentally breaks, he abandons his duties because of, quite frankly, the shitty way he's being treated. He loses battles, but ultimately, he picks himself up and becomes a stronger character because of that suffering, which is honestly part of the reason as to why so many Gundam fans out there love Amuro Ray and detest Kirayamato. The worst suffering that Kira honestly goes through is the fact that he had to have sex with Flay Alster. Oh no, woe was me, the college student, where the worst thing that happens to me is I have sex with a woman that's incredibly blessed in the chest and I end up cucking one of my friends. Whatever shall I do after I'm done banging this woman like a snare drum? Okay, I'm actually kidding there, but you get what I mean. He doesn't really suffer that much, and his whining and emo-ness really comes across as incredibly random. He's supposed to be the character we like, but he's incredibly unlikable. The plot conveniently gives him instant win button after instant win button, but when it comes to his actual characterization, he's kind of a douche. One minute he'll be wondering who's next in battle, while absolutely murking Zaft mobile suits left and right and seeming to enjoy it. And then the next minute he starts crying about the fact that he killed somebody. He's completely detached from anything that has to do with human beings' emotions, or how a normal human being would act until it comes to his relationship with Athrun. That's the only thing that seems to be consistent about him. On top of that, what makes it worse is that he comes to a point where he's basically starting to accept the fact that he's going to have to be a soldier. There's going to be people that he's going to have to fight, and he's going to have to kill to actually save people and protect people. And that death is just something that happens in war. And it's unfortunate, and we have to end war to stop that, but ultimately this is the cards we're dealt, and we have to play them. But then, in the third act, he suddenly becomes incredibly sanctimonious and preachy about war. Keep in mind, he has killed dozens of people throughout the show. So when he does this, he comes across like a giant hypocrite. I could understand Lacus having a really naive view of war, but for Kira it makes no sense. Speaking of not making sense, it's Jesus time, folks. Yes, there is a point where a mobile suit literally blows up in his face, the explosion being so big that it engulfs a large chunk of an island, and he survives only with a few scratches. In fact, the characters of the story go on and on about how improbable his survival is. It's never explained how he did, and it honestly makes it seem like the story is pointing at its own stupidity. So basically, he dies, and then rises again 3 days later, somehow in a colony that's nowhere near the place that he blew up. How he gets there is never fucking explained. The whole situation is just contrived as fuck. Speaking of contrived, I'm sure you've probably already left a comment about Kira being the ultimate coordinator if you're a Gundam Seed fan, and I'm hoping that anybody who leaves a comment as a response to that will be given a timestamp for what I'm about to say. The revelation of Kira being the ultimate coordinator is what we like to call in writing circles an ass pull. It's something that's revealed at the midnight hour to introduce something to the story that's supposed to be a game changer, but it's obvious that it was rushed in. In this particular case, the writer likely didn't realize until the end that they hadn't really explained why Kira is as good as he is, basically why he's a Gary Stew, and this doesn't fix it. Suddenly telling me that he's fucking Captain America doesn't really make me think that, oh, okay, well that makes sense. No, it doesn't. Why the fuck are you just saying this now? Why can't you just say he's good? Why can't you just tell me he was a software developer, or that's what he was studying in college, and he was an ace at it? Does he really have to be the Ubermensch? Why can't you just say something or give him an ability? earlier on and explain that ability earlier on so that it's comprehensible as to why he's able to do the things that he's able to do. You don't need to just make him Ubermensch all of a sudden, because all it really does is solidify the fact that he's a Gary Stu. It's basically the plot telling you, yes, we know he's perfect, yes, we know we've made him perfect, no, we're not changing it, and this is our reason as to why we're justifying the fact that we've made him perfect. Nothing is fixed there. Like a lot of other things about Kira's character, it feels contrived. Trying to cover your ass at the last minute is lazy writing, and there's no way around it. The only thing that gives Kira any improvements is, honestly, the English dub of the remaster. Some of his dialogue is updated in a way that actually has him speaking like a soldier instead of just badgering on about how combat is meaningless, while he shoots down dozens of mobile suits with this instant win button robot. It's kind of hard to sell fighting as pointless when it's solving a bunch of problems for you. Granted, the preachiness still comes from him in the third act, but at least in the second act, it's not as bad. If you ever wonder why so many Gundam fans hate Kirayamato, Yamato, whatever, all you have to do is watch the show. A product of its time. One thing I should mention about Gundam Seed, why it has as many problems as it does, is because, honestly, of the era that it's coming from. Specifically, this is a show that came out in the early 2000s, and it has a lot of the same tropes that a lot of the other shows of its time had. Many of the men in the show are portrayed as Bishonen. Other characters that the show wants you to like are, honestly, sociopaths. The motivation of all the bad guys never goes beyond they're just dicks. And the main character comes across as a preachy brat. These are tropes that, again, like I mentioned, come across several series at the time, and Gundam Seed just happens to fall into it. Thing is, that franchise happens to be Mobile Suit Gundam. Many of the same types of stories that Seed is trying to tell have already been told, and been told better. It's like the creators of Seed were given the formula for the best cake in the world, but instead of using frosting to finish it off, they decided to pour soy sauce on it. That's why I had to mention early on the simple fact that concept-wise Gundam Seed could have been great, and has the foundation for it. But when you have people working on the show that really don't know how to create great characters or give you a world with the necessary complexity, you end up with nothing more than that aforementioned wasted potential. To be honest with you, there are very few likable characters on this show. One thing that I will give credit to the second dub's cast is that their performances were honestly much better than the original dubs. As such, there's a lot more people to enjoy in the cast than the first time around. But the problem is that their stories really just kind of get wrapped up randomly during the second act, and then in the third act you're stuck with the people you didn't like in the first place. Well, except for the captain and Mulaflaga. Just about everybody likes them. A lot of the other characters in this show are just awful human beings. The show is full of bad attitudes and sociopaths, all of whom seem to be completely divorced from the concept of consequence. And then, of course, the characters that are supposed to come across as tragic just don't. Like Nicole. Oh no, Nicole's dead. He liked to play the piano. Really? What else can you tell me about him? He, liked Fur-Elise? And what instrument did he play that on? The piano. The what? The piano. That's what I thought. But anyway, don't get me wrong. I don't mind the fact that every side in the conflict is a bunch of pricks, going back to that. But I'd like to be given more reason as to why they're pricks. Some of it is kind of touched on, but by the time you actually interact with any of these characters, they're not really much more than Hitler. There's nothing wrong with having villains that really aren't likable, and villains that aren't redeemable. But I don't really need every faction to be led by a Giran Zabi clone or Hitler. But that's really all I'm given. There's no variation to it. There's no understanding of why folks are the way that they want to be. There's no real reason as to why all of these things are the way that they are. It's just these people are dicks. And it really makes it seem like there's nothing around that's really worth preserving. Then there's the issue of the heel face turn, where some pilots who committed war crimes are just supposed to have all those terrible things they did be forgotten because the plot is telling you that these are the good guys now, as opposed to properly setting up redemption. Many of the characters who switched sides were basically swayed by the words war bad, peace good, and then realized how they were being murderous fucks out of nowhere. But again, this is a sign of the times. Apparently it doesn't matter if someone shoots down a ship full of refugees or butchers a bunch of family members or blah blah blah. Consequences, karma, and all of that are supposed to be forgotten in the blink of an eye because the plot demands that you root for someone even when you don't want to, or it hasn't properly been set up before. This could have been a story about very good people trapped in a very bad situation, but that lack of consistency and that lack of development is consistent. Basically, it's consistently inconsistent. The fact of the matter is that some of these characters are the obvious protagonists of the story as dictated by the plot, but if they were handled by a better writer, the complications of their situations could have been much more interesting, and certain decisions that they would make, or lives that would get taken, would be that much more impactful. Instead, we're left with protagonists who desire to be complex, but end up just being emo, and villains that might as well all have spindly mustaches that they twirl all the time. It's the same problem that Naruto, Bleach, Inuyasha, and several other anime around this time period had. What could have been an incredibly complex narrative akin to Game of Thrones with giant robots ends up just being Dawson's Creek with giant robots. Oh, I should also mention, Ra Le Creuset, worst and lamest Char clone of all time. Generic, nihilistic, I want to kill everybody villain. He sucks. There's nothing interesting about him. There's nothing I like about him. There's nothing really anybody likes about him. He comes across as a dime a dozen villain, and at the end of it, you don't really want him to die as much as you want him to just shut the fuck up. Show, don't tell. Initially, this video, when I wrote it, only had 2 sections, but I felt the need to add a third. Specifically on one of the biggest problems that this show has, especially in the third act. Telling instead of showing. I'm gonna be honest. The first third of this show isn't bad. The second third of the show is a little worse, but it's still watchable because it could build to something interesting. It just has the problem of constantly doing flashbacks of the big fight between Kira and Athrun way too fucking much. The third act of the show is a fucking slog. The main reason for that is very simple. It's bogged down by constant preaching about how bad war is, and constantly preaching that this conflict isn't going to solve anything, and not enough of just showing exactly how ugly the conflict has become, and having our heroes trying to stop it from getting worse. And lots of flashbacks. Basically, the final conflict in space comes across as being stretched out. There are so many monologues and, again, I'm gonna stop sounding like a broken record, fucking flashbacks that'll make your fucking head spin. What makes these constant monologues and flashbacks so insulting is simply the absolute horror of what goes on in the finale. You see, you're gonna see more genocides and attempted genocides played out firsthand in a bloody fight that sees Ra Le Creuset cackling like a fucking madman because he's just like any other nihilistic villain not named Thanos. It's incredibly violent, incredibly crazy, and has a massive body count. In all seriousness though, the body count in this finale might be the biggest I've ever seen in a Gundam show. Thing is, all of that horror is apparent to the viewer. We get how bad it is, we don't need to be told. Let's imagine for a second that in Avengers Infinity War, Tony Stark went on a long fucking monologue after everyone turned to dust about how bad Thanos is and how bad it is to kill trillions of lives in an instant. Would that have made a lick of sense at that point? Especially after we already knew that? How about if before killing the mob boss at the end of John Wick, John decides to monologue about how bad it is to kill the dog of a widower who is also the deadliest assassin in the fucking world? Would that make sense? Of course not. You don't need to know how bad it is, you just fucking saw it. The funny thing is that Lacus Klein might as well have assembled this universe's version of the Avengers given all the Gundams that she has on her side during the final battle. It's a decent setup, in theory, of how to do a final battle. The good guys don't need to give speeches, they just need to go out there and stop the bad guys. That's it. The horrors of what's going on are going to speak for themselves as they unfold, and you don't need to take time to give the audience a sermon about what the message is. Especially when you've already taken time to show the audience beforehand that these people can't be talked down from their actions because they're basically all Hitler. And I'm not kidding, by the way, on the Hitler thing. There is literally a point in the story where Lacus Klein points out that people on both sides of the conflict are basically Hitler. As such, this show ends not with a bang or a whimper, but a snore, because you've fallen asleep during a battle with enough death to be considered a 1-hour holocaust, which shouldn't happen. You know, I do have to give some credit to the voice actors who worked on the dub of the HD remaster of the series. I'll be frank, the HD remaster is a lot better than the original, and because the casting was a lot better, many of the characters and the voice direction was obviously a lot better. Many of these characters that I kind of didn't give a shit about the first time around ended up with me hoping that they would actually get a good ending. And that's more than what I could honestly say before, at the very least. Plus, it's always nice to hear Casca's voice actress return in any role that I can really hear her in. I'm a big Berserk mark, so that should probably surprise no one. Even so, this is a show that's aged like a banana and had a ton of flaws. In fact, I'm not even quite sure why it was popular. My theory is that at least it was successful in the West at the time simply because it was the new Gundam series. Sort of like how Saint Anger sold a lot of records for Metallica when it came out. You see, we Americans were certainly hungry for more Gundam Wing and G Gundam, but when we started watching Gundam Seed, we suddenly started hearing a snare drum that didn't have the snare turned on. Nothing about the show really measures up to the things that came before it. When it comes to the mech design, which I didn't actually mention during the course of the video, I actually did an entire video with my friends where we broke down the issues with the design that you should definitely check out. The link will be in the description. And on top of that, there really isn't much else to the series to give it any substance or enjoyability. The one thing I find interesting is that these are the same people who brought us Cross Ange, alternatively titled The Island of Angry and Surprisingly Attractive Lesbians Who Die in Very Violent Ways. It is also a show where the villains are caricatures and the characters you're supposed to root for are all miserable human beings. The flip side was that there was at least copious amounts of nudity, so you could at least enjoy the view. The hilarity to me is that this show and its creative staff really just show that, well, they can't tell a story without copious nudity to distract from how bad it is. I'm gonna be honest, if you can't tell a story without shock value, you might as well not come to the table. As such, as the years have gone by, my opinion on Gundam Seed honestly hasn't changed from when I first saw it during Adult Swim. If anything, I lament the fact that the concept wasn't taken on by a better writer. But then again, I could lament in one hand and crap in the other. We all know which one would fill up first. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you're not already subscribed to the channel. Also, if you haven't already, head over to Indiegogo, link in the description, to check out my newest comic, Englewood Book 2. If you missed the first installment, you'll have the opportunity to get it over there as well. With all that said, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. God bless you.